All right, good morning, colleagues. Good morning, guests. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 99 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting today for its study of the opinion by the Supreme Court of Canada on February 9th, 2024, regarding an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses. From Department of Indigenous Services, we have Katrina Peddle. Make sure I have, good morning, Katrina. Director General, Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis Children, Youth and Families Branch. And Katrina is joined by Isabel Quintel, Acting Director General, Strategic Policy and Planning Directorate. And from the Department of Justice, we have Valerie Phillips, Director and General Counsel, Aboriginal Law Centre, and Paula Quigg, Senior Counsel, Aboriginal Law Centre. So welcome. Colleagues, our normal rules for the committee allow for a 5-minute opening statement, but the departmental officials have asked for 10 minutes since this is a one-off study and to set the stage. And so I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to allow a 10-minute opening statement, and then we'll get right into the rounds of questions. Okay, I'm seeing agreement with that. Okay, Leah, you're good? Okay, perfect, and welcome. So we will have 90 minutes with our officials on this study, the one-day study that we're doing, and then we will move into committee business, and we'll go into that when we get to that point of the agenda. So at this point, and I'll use a handy card system here, so when you have 30 seconds left, I'll give a yellow card. When the time's up, I'll give the red card. Don't stop mid-sentence, but just kind of wind up your thoughts, and then we'll keep things moving along that way. And so I will get on my timer 10 minutes, and whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Kwei, bonjour, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to present, to discuss an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. My name is Katrina Peddle. I'm the Director General for the Act, as the Chair has mentioned. I'm a member of the Halibut First Nation, and I'm happy to be with you this morning. I'd like to thank my colleagues for attending with me and appreciate your time to discuss this important piece of legislation. In terms of my purview, I am really just the DG for the Act, so happy to answer questions about it. Beyond that, I may have to take it back for further comments, but do appreciate any questions that you may have. And my Department of Justice colleagues are here to answer technical questions that you might have about the recent opinion of the Supreme Court regarding the Act. So as you know, the Act was really a response that was enacted with the support of all parties to respond to what was really a national crisis about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare systems across the country. This is not a new problem. This is a problem that has existed over many, many generations, from residential schools to the 60s scoop to the overrepresentation now, which actually represents a huge, huge number of children from communities from coast to coast to coast. The real goal of the Act is to address this legacy and to do things here and now to address that overrepresentation and to importantly put jurisdiction back to where it's always belonged, in the hands of communities to direct these child and family services themselves. I will answer in layperson's terms around the Supreme Court, and I'll hand it over to my colleagues for technical views on things, but certainly from where we sit at Indigenous Services, we were very happy to see that we were able to continue to do the work that we've been doing over the past several years to implement the Act as it was found to be constitutionally valid in its entirety. And that, you can imagine from where we sit, was welcome news. We also were really happy to see the endorsement of the work of Parliament to affirm the Indigenous community's inherent right of self-government relating to child and family services, and that enshrining this in law is indeed constitutional. I think for this committee, the decision really does point to the important role of Parliament in deciding to do things quickly, in deciding to put a timeline for reconciliation that may move faster than traditional tools like the courts. And so really what we hope to do and continue to do is to address the harms of the child welfare system that are happening, here today, and also to work to improve the amount of reconciliation that we can do in the span of time that we have in front of us. So really it is about making things move as quickly as we possibly can. So practically speaking, from where we sit, what that means is we continue to do the work in partnership with Indigenous communities who have already asserted jurisdiction and see some of the great success stories that they're having in terms of the work that they're doing on a community level. We've seen that with Peguis. We've also seen that with Splatsin and other communities across the country. It does mean that the urgent work underway doesn't have to slow down, and we can sort of work through the model that we have to continue to get this work done as quickly as we can. So in terms of that, you'll see in your materials something that looks like this. You'll see it in the materials attached to your agenda. And I just wanted to talk in terms of practico-practic, what it means for us when we say communities are reasserting jurisdiction. So for us, there are sort of 4 key components. There's the vision, there's the signal, there's the coordination, and there's the implementation. So you can imagine communities have not just been thinking about reasserting jurisdiction for the past, several years that the Act has been enforced. This has been a conversation that's been happening around the country for decades. So many communities, when this legislation was co-developed, came really ready to put their laws into place and really ready to move quickly. So what we have done as part of implementing the Act is to provide capacity building funding. You'll see that's sort of the second piece on that graphic that I've shared with you. And so about 220 Indigenous governing bodies, so that's basically a group that's been delegated by a community to say, we want you to do this work on our behalf, have started to do that work of saying, okay, what is our law going to say? What do we want to do? What lessons have we learned interacting with the status quo that we want to change? What are the things that we know we want to do, and what pace do we want to do it at? So that work can take a year, it can take 3 years. It really depends on the pace at which communities wish to proceed. It also has to happen in the context of the many, many other things that communities are dealing with on any given day of the week. So once that capacity building work has been done, then there will be a signal, which happens usually through Section 20 of the Act. And the signal either is, we're going, or can we please sit down together? Typically, the signal is, can we please sit down together? And about 75 Indigenous governing bodies have given us that signal since the Act was put into force several years ago. And what that means really is, okay, we are thinking about doing this, let's get ready to go. And then for where we sit, this is where some of the most important work happens, as we have 3 parties, typically the provinces, the federal government, and the Indigenous governing body, who are working together to try and map it all out. Because it's a hugely complex sphere, right? Children are in different places. Sometimes children are living in community. Sometimes there's not a connection to community. They're trying to work all that out. So what that period of time does, and it can be an extensive period of time. We aim for 12 months, but we recognize now with a bit of experience that it can take longer. We are really just trying to put the pieces together with the leadership of communities to make sure that we can get the best coordinated services and enter into a long-term funding arrangement so that the jurisdiction is assumed with the support that communities need. Once that coordination piece is complete, and it is a significant piece of work, I won't underestimate that for you. Then we move into the implementation phase, where communities have reassumed really jurisdiction over their child and family services, and then we continue to work with them as need be. But typically, as you would see in any other type of self-government, the community is doing that work of jurisdiction and doing the work of making sure that children are where they belong, which is close to home, and making sure that families get to see the difference, in the short, the medium, and the long term in terms of those outcomes for children, but also the outcomes for the families themselves. I would also just say there is a lot of this work that reflects some of the commitments that ISK and others have made to the implementation of UNDRIP. And the Supreme Court was clear that this type of work is legislative reconciliation. It does create an important emphasis for the role of parliamentarians to do this work. And I just would like to conclude by saying we'll continue to collaborate across different levels of government to support the work of the Act. And certainly we're delighted to have the opportunity to discuss it with you here today. We all care greatly about it. And we'd be happy to answer your questions. Certainly the technical ones we'll refer to our justice colleagues. Waliak.
Great, thank you. And ahead of the 10 minutes, so well done, thank you. We're going to get into our first round of questions, which are 6 minutes for each of the parties. And just let me reset this. First up, I have Mr. Schmale, who has 6 minutes whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today on a very important topic. Maybe I could just, for those potentially watching or listening at home, we can quickly, in 30 seconds or less, explain how the model works. If a child is taken into custody by a provincial organization, however that goes from there, the cost, I believe, is given to the province for that child. Is that correct?
So that is a very good question. I will try for 30 seconds. I'll try my absolute best. So it depends on which distinction-based group you're speaking about, and it depends on whether there's a First Nations agency that is working with the community or not. But typically, funding that would come through the First Nations Child and Family Services program to fund communities often will flow to a province if there are services that are being provided by a provincial agency, yes. What would be different under the Act if, say, for example, a community that has assumed jurisdiction, then it would be the community that would have that funding, and it would be the community that would decide what is the course of action. And the real big difference that we've seen, and we see this elsewhere in provincial child welfare too, is a big focus on prevention. What we often think of child welfare is we think of apprehension, we think of foster care, we think of kids being away from the home. And what the Act really tries to do is front end the other actions that can be taken to prevent that, right? To support families, to support communities, to sort of provide a different context so that apprehension doesn't need to happen and that child can stay with their family.
Perfect. So I take it everyone has seen that Global News article about Indigenous kids in Northern Ontario specifically. Now, given that the majority of those kids mentioned in the article were given to the provincial agency for, if you can say care, I guess. Are steps being put in place so that we don't have more stories where we're being seen headlines like Indigenous kids are being used as cash cows?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. I think absolutely you see that with the implementation of this jurisdiction. Children are being kept within communities. I think about the example of Peguis. I think about the example of Wabasamung, where children are being kept closer to home. And there's a lot of focus also if a child needs to be apprehended, like what is the circle of care around that child? So that would start immediately with the parent or parents or people in a role of a parent. Then you're thinking about aunts, uncles, cousins, caring folks in that child's life. And what other resources that the community might have. And then you think about Indigenous people outside of that circle, and then only outside of all those concentric circles would you think of a situation where a child would be in care really in that distant kind of way. So really the purpose of the Act is to avoid exactly that.
So the communities I'm speaking with, many are saying they've had enough of the Ottawa Knows Best approach, kind of what you're saying, how the communities want the control of the care of their kids, which I think all of us support in this room. Having said that, according to this Global News article, the disparity in the cost. So apparently, according to this article, a for-profit group home in Northern Ontario gets about roughly 26% more funding for an Indigenous child compared to a non-Indigenous child. Is there been any accountability for that money, given that we are seeing case after case of neglect and wrongdoing in many cases? It doesn't seem like the extra money is being put into culturally appropriate care or anything like that. It just seems like the money's being paid, the children are off somewhere, and according to the article, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away from their families or their communities. If the Indigenous communities are saying, we're ready, if this abuse is happening, how much time are we talking about till this gets corrected?
That's a very good question, and thank you for it. I think that what we see is a problem that everyone recognizes across the board, right? The status quo is not working. There have been significant investments in the First Nations Child and Family Services program, so that program's funding has increased by about 200% since 2006. However, the taking control of those services, right, the jurisdictional piece under C92 does take a period of time, right? So what we hope to see is that a community seeks to assert jurisdiction, moves through capacity building relatively quickly. You know, it can happen in less than a year depending on this, you know, what communities wish to do and the timing of that, and then move through coordination and agreement discussions, and then they've assumed jurisdiction. And what is